Dear Gottfried, thank you very much for accepting my invitation to talk about Otto Gross. This is a series I call Breakfast at Kuznach. Perhaps we can also call it Breakfast Beyond Kuznach,
Yes.
although Otto Gross is so linked to Kuznach, to Carl Gustav Jung. But this interview doesn't aim to look at Jung and Gross, it's really looking at Gross. Who was Otto Gross?
Well, first, thank you ever so much for this opportunity to speak with you about Otto Gross. Otto Gross was he lived between 1877 and 1920, and he was an early psychoanalyst who revolutionized important aspects of psychoanalysis, and he went too far with the changes that he suggested, and for that he got, in today's language we would call blacklisted. He got pushed out of the psychoanalytic community, mainly because of his, well, I can say mainly because of his taking Freud by his word. Freud had written in, I think, 1907 that our neuroses have their origin in the society we live in. And I think it's true to say Gross had arrived at that conclusion already earlier on because of his anarchist friends. But he linked psychoanalysis with political activism, and that came to a head between him and Freud at the 1908 Salzburg Congress, where Gross writes later, Freud clearly said to him, "We are psychoanalysts, we are doctors, and doctors we shall remain." So that's the main reason for him having been excluded.
What was he concerned with? What are the key areas, aspects of his investigation?
He did not use the term, but the first thing that comes to my mind is trauma, the trauma of the child in the traditional patriarchal family. And that was one of his main concerns, and the other, linked to what I've mentioned before, to see the family structures, the intrafamiliar politics, so to speak, in the patriarchal family, linked to the authoritarian patriarchal structure of the rest of society. And he worked, I mean, Jung's term, the archetype of the wounded healer, comes to mind in this context, although it didn't exist in the early 1900s, of course. Gross worked in this from his own traumatic experience as a small child in English we say in the Victorian society, I mean the late Habsburg society of southern Austria. Yeah,
comes to my mind that he proposed a matriarchal society instead of a patriarchal society, and that he was trapped in what, yes, in Jungian's term would be a parental complex.
Absolutely, yes.
But he was never able to overcome it. And it's interesting that the life he conducted was going or offering the matriarchal society, and then being an anarchist, perhaps a free spirit, yet sons and daughters with different women, perhaps at the same time. How does this match or doesn't match?
As with many of us, his ideas and his ideas which he wrote about in his works did not, sadly, painfully, tragically, did not correspond
To the man.
to the man, to the life that he lived. Yes, of course you're right, we can speak about a parental complex. Yes, parental complex in the sense of both a father complex as well as a mother complex, we could say. That grew out of, or was triggered by his upbringing. He hated his father and was locked really in a lifelong battle with him, dreaming actually, I mean, in the sense of daydreaming, of, he in 1913, he said to some psychiatrists who were interviewing him, I want to die young, preferably preferably by killing an investigating judge, so that we both die at the same time. I mean, in today's world, that is clearly a suicidal terrorist. That's how far his hatred went towards his authoritarian father. At the same time, for the whole of his life, he was financially dependent on his father. And when his father died, Hans Gross, in 1915, Otto Gross continued to be financially dependent on his mother. I think he was attracted to I think it can be said, to a romantic version of matriarchy out of his longing for motherly love, which he hadn't received much, and I don't think he mentions Backofen in any of his works, but clearly he was influenced by Bachofen's ideas, who were very popular in Ascona in Switzerland at the time. Again, in today's words, we could say the countercultural capital of the whole of Europe, where he went in 1905 and met two German anarchists there who, I think, channeled his rebellious feelings towards his parents and patriarchal society into the direction of anarchist politics. And it must have been there through these that he was also introduced to the works of the Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin, who had published in this country, in England, in 1902, a very important book written as in one aspect, we could say as an anti-Darwin book. I mean, Darwin, if we simplistically reduce Darwin's ideas, it's the survival of the fittest, the fight of everyone against everybody else, in a very simplified version. And Kropotkin wrote a book, Mutual Aid, as a factor in evolution. So rather than fighting against each other, he observed, which has now been confirmed with latest research. I'm thinking of Antonio Damasio's latest work, of the important factor of cooperation, or in Kropotkin's words, mutual aid. And Otto Gross, as I say, was very influenced politically by these anarchist ideas. He later said, I am an anarchist, all my friends are anarchists, I find things are wrong in this society, and as I believe that everything needs to be changed, I am an anarchist. Importantly, that he also transferred Kropotkin's concept of mutual aid into the psychoanalytic therapeutic situation, and practiced, before he met Jung, practiced mutual aid in the sense of mutual therapy, where the roles change. So it, again, in today's language, we could say they practiced a co-counseling avant la lettre.
And even perhaps when I was reading your book, you at page 10 you write, Gross' concept of dialectic intersubjectivity is based on the anarchist principle of mutual exchange
Yes.
between equals in the psychoanalytic relationship. Could we consider Gross as a pioneer of relational psychoanalysis? Intersubjectivity is very interesting, this link.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, analytic writers speak about the relational turn. I mean, the turn meaning the change from the traditional doctor-patient relationship with the all-knowing doctor and
Patient.
and the patient desperate for
Help.
for the doctor's help, and which is a hierarchical relationship. I mean, with the doctor up here and the patient somewhere down there. And Gross, we could call this a one-person psychology, because the focus of the therapist, the analyst, is exclusively on the sick or ill neurotic patient. And the relational turn towards a two-person psychology, where the psychology, meaning the feelings and emotions, transferences of the analyst, the therapist, are also taken into account. And the source of this, from all that I can see, is Gross, with his transferring the political concept, the political anarchist concept of Kropotkin into the consulting room, which Jung then later on ingeniously, I feel, in my estimation, it's one of the most important aspects of Jung's work, which Jung then refined, I could say, into that transference diagram of the mutual relationship between equals. I do believe that, I mean, of course, Jung found the origins of this transference diagram in the alchemical images of the Rosarium. I believe, though, that it makes sense to me to believe that his experience of, over periods, a mutual analysis with Otto Gross in 1908 played a big role in that. He says, I'm spending all my time, in his letter to Freud, in one of his letters to Freud, he says, I'm spending all my time on Gross, and sometimes when we get stuck, he analyzes me. And that's the first recorded, so to speak, mutual analysis. I mean, as I said, in
before the Francis one, even.
Yes, people who write about the origins of the relational usually speak about Ferenczi and do not mention Gross, which I think is wrong. I think Ferenczi was influenced in this way by Gross. They were friends, they were close together, they even had the same political ideas until 1908, where Gross was rejected for his political ideas, and we could say Ferenczi towed the party line. He held back with his political ideas, which were at the time quite similar to Gross. A Hungarian,
perhaps without the destructivity of the poor. Destructivity. Sometimes it's very interesting to see that the ideas of Otto Gross permeated major psychoanalysts.
Yes.
They were a small circle. Sometimes an idea is not able to get through because there is too much eros in Jungian term, there is too much strength.
Yes.
It's not told, it's not explained in the correct way so that the other can understand it without the strong push.
In his theories, Gross was, I feel like saying, a peaceful man. I'm saying this because another one of his most important legacies is, and it is linked to the mutual communication as equals. He wrote, and that continues to have a huge value from my perspective in any kind of relating, be that in our personal relationships, in our professional relationships, also intrapsychically, as well as interpersonally, and also politically in any context. He said, the highest goal of every revolution is to replace the will to power with the will to relating. That feels to me a much more profound formulation of what was later turned into a slogan, not with reference to Otto Gross, but it's the make love, not war, but on a really powerfully interpersonal and intrapersonal level. And that is one of his most important legacies that he left to us, as a potential to be hopefully more and more fulfilled.
And perhaps this is, my third question would be, what is his relevance in the 21st century. But I feel right now what you just said, this is really his relevance.
That is his greatest the greatest relevance that I can see. I mean, as I was kind of sketching out earlier, he was instrumental in many of the most important, from my perspective, in many of the most important changes of psychoanalysis when psychoanalysis was really in the very early years. And I feel that is important to notice that and to note that, and not to overlook it, not to say, oh, he was just a crazy drug addict and we don't need to bother with him. But in terms of what is, so that is of historical relevance. In terms of what is important for us today, it is this, the replacing the will to power in any relationship with the will to relating, linked, and in this also he was years earlier than Jung with the spiritual religious aspect. He saw that as linked. He saw relating on a deep level always having a spiritual, religious, as a religious component. He speaks of the holiness of the relationship,
which can only be if there is a relationship, a profound relationship between two human beings that is brought by empathy, equivalence, mutuality.
Yes.
What is psychoanalysis for Otto Gross? What is the aim of it? Perhaps revolution? In your book, you cited Colin Covington. Analysis is essentially a tool for revolution. But then I would wonder, which kind of revolution? There have been many revolutions in the past 100 years. And we can also relate, as you do, to Andrew Samuels, the term tikkun, healing the word.
Yes.
Healing the soul, healing your soul could be your own revolution. Individuation, to become yourself, to become the person you have never been. What is psychoanalysis for Otto Gross?
He literally, I mean, in his words, he says he sees psychoanalysis as a preparatory work for the revolution. He realizes that, and he says so, I mean, these are almost his words, he says all the revolutions of the past have failed because the revolutionaries were concerned with outer change and were not able to realize that they carried the old structures, the old hierarchical structures, power structures inside. And that's why all revolutions failed and just turned into a copy of what had been before.
A compensation of the previous status. Look at 68. And then a failed revolution because looking not at mutuality, but looking again at a new will to power.
Absolutely. And he saw the chance, the opportunity to, via psychoanalysis, to change these inner structures so that they would not be able to turn the outer revolution into more of the same, into what had been there before. That was his fervent hope and belief that was the chance, and that's where he felt, I think, abandoned by Freud. Because, as I said, theoretically, there are links to Freud. I mean, when as I mentioned before, then if Freud says our neuroses are rooted in the society that we live in, I mean, that's Gross could have written that. I mean, he clearly very strongly agreed with that. You asked what kind of revolution, and in that context, you mentioned healing. That is the revolution that he envisaged, a healing both individually, a healing from our individual wounds with the help of psychoanalysis, and simultaneously a healing, a change of the outer structures, the hierarchical structures of patriarchal society that cause our wound, that cause these individual wounds.
And I also wonder whether, maybe you can call me romantic, but revolution can only happen through and thanks to love. Again, the difference between the will to power, there is no love. And in the relationality of the revolution that Gross talks about is key. But let me read another sentence you...
I absolutely agree with you on the love, yes.
A few minutes ago you talked about the longing for love, the hate for his father.
Yes.
I mean, compensation to hate is love, compensation to love is hate. And again, this mother, which was absent although there. A quote from your book is, "Our pain doesn't come from the love we weren't given in the past, but from the love we ourselves aren't giving in the present." This is by Williamson.
Yes.
Isn't this also what Jessica Benjamin,
Sure.
Susie Orbach, feminist psychoanalysis, or recent psychoanalysis is about?
I absolutely agree, yes.
We could also put Bowlby, Winnicott,
Yes.
etc. But
Yes,
the
absolutely.
key is love.
Yes, which is another thing that actually Freud very early on said to Jung. The cure is affected. The cure is affected by love, and it's interesting to realize that this is not something that Otto Gross said, although he could have said it. He would have absolutely agreed with that, but it comes from Freud.
There is another sentence, now it's your sentence, which touched me deeply. And perhaps this is the big difference between you and Otto Gross.
Yes.
You wrote, in the process of learning to love, I'm also learning to feel loved, to accept love for myself. He didn't give himself the chance to be loved and to stay there. He always had perhaps to move on, as he couldn't believe that the love was given by this man, Jung as a medical doctor taking care of him, or his wife, or a lover he had, could be a place where to stay and develop. I say this because the relationship between him and Jung is very strong. Jung he was contained somehow by Emma, maybe by Emma's wealth. Without Emma, perhaps there would be no Jung. Who knows? I'm reading a recent published book about Emma. Love and Sacrifice, I think, is the title. And Jung grew up in a society, because of his father, that couldn't look into polygamy. But when he met Otto Gross, he changed his mind. While Otto Gross somehow was coming from a different point of view. Society is not embedding me, society is something that I have to get rid of. And it's interesting that Jung could continue work, could come back from his night journey.
Absolutely.
Because he had a safety around him, psychological and not. There, Tony steps in. And Gross never had this. Is my fantasy.
I felt really touched by what you said at the beginning of what you were just saying about Gross probably being unable to believe that he could be loved. That I hadn't really looked at him in this way before, and I, as I say, I'm moved by that, and I believe it's absolutely true. I see that as possibly the root of his. We could speak of a sexual restlessness, yeah. to have one woman after the other, which is not, which in the way I see it, well, in the way that how the women he was with wrote about their relationship with him, they did not feel loved. His wife felt close to suicide even whilst she was pregnant with his son. That is not a healing love relationship.
This is interesting because just now came to my mind a patient who is very, very successful professionally. Could we say he has a parental complex? Mother negative. Both mother and father negative complex. And when he comes in, it's like very sad, very depressed, and maybe a split off complex. And in the last supervision, we were able to look at the fact he's not able to relate. And he, like Otto Gross, has a series of lovers with whom he doesn't engage. This is interesting for me to look at Otto Gross. On the one hand, the need of mutuality, relationability, but on the private sphere, the impossibility of love.
The impossibility to live his ideas, which we initially were referring
like
to.
Like Marcuse said, the philosopher is not, can live a life, but his philosophy is something else.
Which it shouldn't, ideally it shouldn't, but of course, as I say, I guess it's for most, or for, if not for all of us, that
we go back to Andrew and plurality.
Yes.
Linking to this, there is a sentence in the book I just mentioned. There is a sentence in a letter from Jung to Freud in Maguire, 1979, letter 175, where Jung is saying, "The prerequisite for a good marriage, it seems to me, is the license to be unfaithful." How much of Otto Gross is in this sentence? How much of Jung is in this sentence? How much of Freud is in this sentence? If we also look at the relationship between Freud, his wife, and his sister-in-law.
It takes me back to what you movingly said a moment ago, to the inability or the incapacity to believe that I am lovable. I mean, which I think applies to to Gross as much as to Freud, as well as to Jung. All three of them, we can say from today's perspective, have been sexually traumatized, sexually abused. And a terrible, ongoing, continuing legacy of this can be, just as the client that you referred to a moment ago, the I am not really lovable, so there is a line from a Goethe poem, und bist du nicht willig, dann brauche ich Gewalt. If you are not accede to my wishes, I will use power. And tragically, I'm not excusing what all of the three men that we're looking at.
Yeah.
I don't mean to excuse what they did to the women they were involved with. But that is the source, and in my feelings, it goes more, as the line from the Goethe poem, it goes more in the direction of power, of conquering women, than in the direction of love and healing.
Which sounds very difficult in these past few years of the 21st century. We had hope a few years ago that things were going in a different way, but now it really looks like a regression, a worldwide regression to old threats.
Absolutely, yes.
And is it the
Yes.
psychosocial or the political need to look into this, I would say psychoanalytically, like Andrew says on the Politics on the Couch, the possibility for psychoanalysis to serve as a tool, an additional tool to history, sociology, and whatever, to look into what is happening from a deep psychology point of view.
Yes. Yes.
Last December, when we met for the first time in Prague, you told me a story. You told me that you spent a considerable amount of time looking for Otto Gross' grave in Berlin Pankow. Do you want to share more about this, perhaps?
I think it would. It's part of it. It has been part of my research to find out where is he buried, and there is only a line in Emanuel Horwitz's book, the first really groundbreaking account of Otto Gross's life and work, published 1979, sadly only in German language, where he says, accidentally, Gross was buried on a Jewish cemetery in Berlin, and of course the Jewish, all in all there were originally 6 Jewish cemeteries in Berlin. Of course, they did not survive the Nazi times unscathed. So what is left of them, and what is left of records that had been kept, I did research and contacted the various administrations, and there is no trace of Gross. The man with whom I co-founded the International Otto Gross Society, Raimund Demlo, has some theories about that possibly a rich industrialist who helped Gross financially may have given Gross a grave in his family plot, but that's rumor. It's unsubstantiated, and we don't know.
My last question for you today would be: how is the society going to honor? I was about going to say celebrate. Perhaps
Yes.
even either for celebration.
Yes.
The 100th anniversary of his death in Berlin, which happened on the 13th of February of
Yes.
1920.
First, I'd like to say that the original International Otto Gross Society, it founded on around power issues, and it does not exist anymore. I recently initiated the International Association for Otto Gross Studies, and we had the 10th International Congress last year, October, in Moscow, which was absolutely wonderful. It coincided with the 100th anniversary of the Russian October Revolution. I imagine that Otto Gross would have been very pleased about that. Also last year, the first Portuguese translation of his most important later works, where he links psychoanalysis with radical politics, have been translated and edited in Sao Paulo in Brazil by Marcelo Quecchia, and he and I are considering the possibility of having the next International Otto Gross Congress coinciding with the 100th anniversary of his death in Sao Paulo in Brazil, which would be absolutely wonderful. I mean, obviously it's the Southern Hemisphere, and all the previous congresses in various European cities have all been in the Northern Hemisphere. It would be absolutely wonderful if we managed to do that. So that's the plan at the moment.
Thank you, Gottfried. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity again too. Thanks a lot.
Good. Very good. Let's see how did it go.